Hello everybody, I'm really glad you can make it here today. If you're new around here, thanks for dropping by, and if you are a returning viewer, it's good to see you again. I really do appreciate you coming back. So, I have to apologize first for not uploading a video last week. I was quite busy doing this one, and this is a pretty exciting video, at least for me, since this is the first aircraft I've done in at least 8 years, and also because this title isn't clickbait. I wanted to do something a bit different for my first aircraft, and the idea of weathering a model entirely in acrylics was a video topic that I wanted to cover, so I just figured I'd hit two birds with one acrylic stone with this video. Is this the best way of weathering an aircraft? Nope, not at all, and I'm not claiming that it is, but for something experimental, and yes, everything that I got on video was my first time doing it, I think that I achieved something interesting, at least for me. I'm also considering making this type of video for armor or doing like a similar type of video, but if you'd like to see that, please consider subscribing. Enough of me talking though, let's have voiceover me take it away.
Here's our subject matter for today's video, the I-16 by ICM in 1/72nd scale, of course. And so far it has just been primed in Mr. Servicer 1000, and naturally we're going to start off this video by base painting it, and we're going to start with the green that goes on the upper surfaces of this aircraft. However, I didn't have a green color that I liked straight out the bottle, so I decided to mix my own. And I had 4 colors that I started off with. First one is NATO Green from Vallejo's Model Air range. We also have their IJA Parched Earth from their Imperial Japanese Army tank color set. We also have their German Dark Yellow, as well as their German Field Gray. And I'm just going to mix these 4 colors together until I have a shade of green that I am pretty happy with. So here's the reasons why I use this color. This color is going to be predominantly the NATO green, as you'll see. Predominantly the NATO green. And I have those 2 colors, the Parched Earth and the Field Gray, to fade it out in a way that just doesn't kill all the vibrancy. But if I feel that the vibrancy needs to be replaced, I have the Gelb working in there. Once again, we're using the NATO green predominantly because it's the greenest out of our colors. But I decided to use a bunch of model colors because Model Air, it doesn't have really good coverage properties and it dries a bit too glossy for my taste. So the model colors are there in the mix for that reason. And here I am just applying it. I am using vertical streaks primarily, at least all the places where I can use vertical streaks, I will. And that is so if my paint coat it's not as perfect as I want it to be, the vertical streaks can eventually become streaking effects, and we can start off the weathering that way. And here it is, the green has been applied. It is quite dark, I have to say, and we are going to next work on the light blue that goes on the underside of this aircraft. But here's the thing, when I started this recording, I didn't have a blue color from Vallejo, so I decided to mix up the next best thing, an approximation for light blue. It's actually a light bluish green, and I have 3 colors, some white, some Midori green. I use that one because it has some blue tones in it, and some flat flesh. I first came across this paint mixture when I was doing French armor, because French armor, they have that light bluish green color, and it's not a perfect light blue, but you know, when you don't have a blue and you need something to work in a pinch, this is a pretty good substitute. I do use some cheap acrylic blue paint from Walmart. It's like $1, very cheap, but it works really well with Vallejo, I have to say. On its own, that paint, it dries pretty flat, and it has pretty good coverage properties provided that you thin it, because it does come pretty thick right out of the bottle, but it works really well with Vallejo, and because it dries so flat, it can sort of counteract the effects of Model Air if I choose to use it, because once again, Model Air, when you brush paint it, it dries really glossy, and that is something that I just don't like at all. Here is our aircraft so far. As you have just seen, it has been base painted, and I painted those tires off camera. And let's start the weathering. And I figured that I'd start off the weathering with a wash. But here's the thing, when you normally think of a wash, at least when I normally think of a wash, I think of, you know, an oil product or an enamel product, but this video is about weathering entirely in acrylic, so I had to rethink the wash process a bit, and this is what I came up with at first. So as you can see, I have some model color, German camouflage black brown, which I'm going to use for the wash itself, as well as some paint retarder, and that is done to make sure that the paint doesn't dry out too fast. Additionally, I plan on just swamping the entire surface of the model in water, and that is for two reasons. One, because it is wet, I thought that it would keep the paint from drying out too fast, and also because the surface of the model is soaked, it would help the paint flow a bit better. So here I am mixing this color and using the retarder. It's about 50-50 equal parts paint to thinner, and here I am mixing everything. In addition to the retarder, I used a bit of water to thin the paint out quite a bit. It is a very thin coat, and here I am starting to apply it. Of course, we start off by soaking the model in water, and I am using multiple coats of water because, once again, I want to make sure that this paint doesn't dry out too fast, because that was my main concern working with acrylics. I didn't want things to dry out too fast and just to have a mistake that I would have to, reapply the blue to clean up. But here I am, and I'm applying the brown now. As you can see, it's thinned out quite a bit, and the way it's thinned out is very strange, at least for me. I'm not sure if this is because all the excess water or the retarder, but it is quite cloudy. It's very weird, and it is quite fascinating. Spoiler alert, this didn't provide me the result that I was looking for, but I'm sure it has some other applications. I'm sure, if you're doing something like dust, I'm sure there are other applications, but this wasn't really what I was looking for. However, it is quite fascinating, I think, to look at the way that the paint is thinned out. Once again, it is very cloudy, it is very uneven, but you can sort of see what I was going with the water. The paint has sort of flowed in quite nicely into some aspects, like where the wing root is, for lack of a better term. It doesn't work too well on the flatter areas, but I mean, when there's detail, my method, I guess, worked. The paint did flow quite nicely, and you can just see more of that going on. It's not perfect, but I mean, where it does flow where I want it, it does work nicely. And I am, as you've seen, I do clean off a bit of it with a Q-tip in vertical motions, just to simulate streaking, because if I can't get a wash, I can at least get some streaks. And here I am, of course, applying it to the upper sides of the aircraft, just keeping in mind flooding the surface with water just to make sure that the paint doesn't dry. And this is the result of it so far. You can't really, see it on the green, but on the brown, it is a bit more visible, of course, because it's a lighter color, and it has dried, and there are a bit of tide marks that I'm not happy with, and I will have to blend that out. And you can see on the green, where the engine cowling is, that flowed in quite nicely, I have to say. Proof that this method sort of works, but you do have to do multiple passes, and it is, of course, not ideal. But if you only have acrylics, I guess you can sort of get a type of wash to form. So next up, we are going to do a bit of discoloration and some distressing, and this is a technique that I picked up from doing armor, but I don't think it'll hurt at all, especially since our aircraft is, pretty much a single color, green on the top, blue on the bottom. And you can see on my wet palette what I've got going on. We have a lighter color, the one surrounding it, that is the original shade I painted the aircraft with, just as a bit of a comparison. And here I am just applying it. A few things to keep in mind. First off, with the paint, you want this paint to be thinned out a bit, not too much. You want these patterns to happen. You don't want it to just be one uniform thing, but you do want your paint to flow a bit to make these patterns, a thing, because you want this to be as random as possible. And that is my second point, randomness. You want this to be very random. As a result, I'm just doing stippling motions. I'm not caring too much about what the patterns look like. I think the only thing I was caring about is making sure that the green wouldn't go on to the blue. You can see what I've got going on. Sometimes I'm stippling it, sometimes I'm doing sort of scrubbing motions. I'm not really caring whatsoever. I just want there to be all sorts of inconsistencies and lines and patterns and just interest going on, because that's what I felt that this aircraft was missing. A bunch of interest. It was plain green on the top and plain blue at the bottom, and I wanted to change that. Another thing to keep in mind with the distressing in this coloring, I use multiple colors for this. I use, I think, maybe 3, I'm not sure. But with each color, each new one, it gets progressively lighter and lighter. And I take advantage of that to do a bit of highlighting. So anything on the aircraft that I want to get highlighted, I use, these colors more and more. You can see the tops, those machine guns, there's that panel that I keep going over, the top of the aircraft, that sort of thing. Just anything that I want to get highlighted, I go over and over with all these distressing colors, because since these colors get progressively lighter and lighter, I want them to stand out. I also use them to paint the control surfaces of the I-16, since they were fabric covered and they would be a bit different in shade than the metal and wood parts of the aircraft. So in addition to discoloration, I also use this technique for highlights. And here I am just working on the bottom of the aircraft, because the top of the aircraft isn't the only part of it. Additionally, on the bottom of the aircraft, which is pretty crucial because it's a lighter color, obviously, the effects of that attempt at a wash, all those disgusting tide marks, they show a bit more. And I also use these colors to clean things up. I go over pretty much all of that wash I applied, except in the parts where I want it. And yes, I use it to clean up. So it creates, there are multiple uses for this. And also, one thing to keep in mind, because these distressing colors, they're thinned out. They're not as opaque as just, the color itself. Because they're thinned out, when you apply them over a darker color, it blends things out a bit. And as a result, there are still some brown tones, which I like, and which would be appropriate on the underside of an aircraft, but they're a lot less stark because of it. So there are multiple benefits to this. It's sort of, it sort of does it all, at least for me. And here it is so far. I keep saying so far, but I did some stuff off camera that I apologize for. I blended it out with a filter. Very simple, just a filter of green on the green areas and a filter of the light blue on the light blue areas. And what we're going to be doing now is applying the decals. And I made sure to do the discoloration before the decals, because one thing I'm always cautious about is carrier film. I'm not necessarily saying that on every decal I do, I trim up all the excess carrier film, but that is something I keep in mind. Because depending on, if there's carrier film or not, you can have, I guess, it's hard to put it into words, but I mean, I didn't want to put the decals onto a pretty much pristine aircraft, and when I did the discoloration, there would be these outlines of just, the pristine green when there was all the discoloration going on. But I applied the decals, and as you can see, there's a bit of a wash going on. This was my second attempt. It was more successful, and I had a new method for this. It's sort of similar to my first attempt, but it is quite different. Now for a few things, what I do is, it's very similar, right? I soak the model in water, but instead of just flooding the entire surface of the aircraft, in this case the wing, I'm a bit more controlled. It's a bit more localized. You can see there's like a panel line that I'm choosing to work on, so I'm just covering that panel line in water. And this is pretty much I guess the trend for the brown color. One thing to note, the brown color, I didn't use any retarder for this one. It was just thinned out somewhat, and as you'll see, I end up tracing the area that I want to have a wash in. And then I do the same, blending it out, but I think the tracing, a single point, it allows for a few improvements over my previous method. Because I'm working in such a small space at a time, I can avoid all these excess tide marks. I'm not working over too much of an area at once. And yes, because I'm working on a smaller area, I do have to do a few more passes, but I would much rather do multiple passes and build it up gradually than, have a bunch of disgusting tide marks and then just have to redo all of the discoloration and all the distressing that I did because I tried to work too quickly and I just ruined everything. This is a part of the aircraft that I decided to go a bit heavier with, just because I felt that, the engine cowling, the machine gun, that area, it would get a bit grimier than the rest of the aircraft. I'm not trying to be careless, but I mean, that's just what I felt was accurate, at least for me. And here I am applying it to the bottom of the aircraft, and this sort of is an interesting paradox because it's a lighter color. You want to be more cautious with this ground, but I feel like the bottom of an aircraft, it gets so much dirtier, so you can kind of afford to, I guess, go heavier, but I mean, with the way the acrylic is, you kind of really do have to be careful. Here is the bottom of the aircraft. I know it looks like there's a lot going on since, you saw it last, but there really hasn't. However, I have a bit of a confession to make. You can see that I applied some dust, and that was done with pigments. I know it's a bit of a confession. This video was, using acrylics to weather an aircraft, but at the end of the day, there are some things that, pigments are good for, and I couldn't really replicate, dust the way a pigment does, and that's why I used it. As you can see, in addition to that, let's get back to the wash. I applied some streaks in a fashion that is quite similar to the wash itself. I got the surface of the aircraft wet, I painted on the streak, and then I used a combination of both, the surrounding water and a clean brush to blend it. And I also used some of the light blue acrylic color to cover the wash to blend it out. Furthermore, I found out that that really helped with blending things. You can also see there's a streak that I applied underneath the engine. But yes, I did some streaks. They cannot possibly compare to streaks done with oils or enamels because, they just can't. But I mean, if you don't like the way it looks, I can, just turn the plane right side up. I want to direct your attention to the prop. It has been painted white, and it doesn't really focus, but I got a quite patchy look. And here's the thing with white. White is a color that I have found to be very difficult to paint if you want it to be very clean, very even, all that sort of stuff. And it's very hard to do that, but it is a color that is very easy to get very patchily, very, what I'm looking for, quite weathered, and that is what I'll be showing you. I have this square of plastic card that it's gray because I primed it with Mr. Surfacer, and I think crucial to this technique is to prime it in gray because it sort of lends itself to this technique. The gray provides a bit of depth, and here's what I've got going on. Well, basically, I'm doing discoloration, and if you've seen the video I made on the winter camouflage for that tiger, it's pretty much the exact same thing, but only in acrylics. And it is quite similar to, the previous weathering steps that I did. But as you can see, I'm just trying to, make things as random as possible. I am using as you can see, it's more scrubbing motions, and this is basically what I've got going on. I sort of skipped a few steps, but I mean, you're just painting this on as inconsistently and as randomly as possible. And what I am doing now is just blending everything together with a coat of white that has been thinned quite a ways. You don't want to get rid of all of that inconsistency, and here it is when it dries. Of course, I can go further with all the blending, but that just makes this section of this video a bit redundant. But if you don't like all the patches, you want them to be more subtle, you can of course blend things out with more and more coats of white thin paint. But it looks pretty good so far, and on as small an area as the nose cone, it works pretty well. Here is our finished I-16, and yes, these are all the paints that I used for this project. And at the end of the video, there will be shots of it from different angles. So I'll be leaving the final verdict up to you all. Once again, this isn't the best way to weather an aircraft by far, but if we're just talking about these techniques I think it turned out much better than I thought it would. I really didn't have any, expectations for this. The bar was set very low for this project. And of course, I could go further with weathering, and I might do that at least after I publish this video. But if we're just talking about working with acrylic paints, this is as far as I can go, at least in my opinion, to make the technique work. I'm sure that someone with more experience and more skill can use only acrylics in a way that's just mind-blowing. However, I don't think I'm quite there yet. But this project has certainly given me a few ideas, at least going forward. So, while I was working with acrylics, I came across a few pros and cons. And let's start positive with the pros. First off, you get an incredibly quick work time. There's none of the whole, oh, let me wait 2 or 3 days for my paint to dry. There's none of that. Even when I was trying to do a wash and the whole model was swamped with water, even when that was a thing, it took minutes. I think 15 minutes at the most for my paint to dry. Additionally, with acrylics, you can get some relatively strong coats. I know that I use Vallejo for this, and Vallejo, they really aren't the strongest paint out there, but if you're using something stronger, let's say Tamiya, Mr. Hobby, any of that lacquer type stuff, you can get some really strong coats. Additionally, there's a very wide range of colors, which are easy to mix. You can get lots of shades with acrylics. Even that really cheap blue paint that I used when I was working on the underside, that cheap paint from Walmart, it mixed incredibly well with Vallejo, and that is an extreme advantage I believe that acrylics have over even enamels and oils. However, this technique or this style of weathering isn't without its drawbacks, and the two biggest cons that I came with are difficulty with blending and trouble with the paint flow. So difficulty with blending, that's pretty self-explanatory. Acrylics dry fast, even with retarder and lots of water. You can't blend out acrylics in the way that you can with enamels and oils. And for this second issue, the trouble with the paint being able to flow, that might have just been the paints I had. It might have been the retarder, it might have been all the water I used, but I really couldn't get the paint to flow without breaking. It's like when you mess up making a song. But anyways, I think we've reached the end of this video. I want to thank you all for watching, especially if you've stuck around this far. And if you like this video, consider liking, subscribing, hitting the notification bell, all of that good stuff. I'd also really like to know your thoughts about this style of video. I said before that, I wanted to make similar videos, doing painting and weathering only with one style of paint, maybe enamels, maybe oils, and maybe I could even do this style of video, only acrylics with armor. But anyways, enough of that. I just want to, once again, thank you all for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be seeing you in the next one, whenever that is.